Good morning.
Good to see you today, back from Christmas and Epiphany. This class, we will study, we hope, one parable, but do a little bit of recap. And also, we've invited your questions, but please feel free, particularly this time, to ask all you want. The remaining classes now through May sometime, with a few skips here and there, we'll be discussing, looking at together some of these parables. Aaron and I had never worked together before this class and planned it out really intensively. You may remember the first one, and we realized that's dumb. We're both better at, we read a bunch and then say, let's talk about this, this, and this, and then just go. And so that's what we've done the rest of the time, learning to work together. And so we're also learning with you, from one another, from you. And so think of this as not necessarily a dialogue, but a kind of a group discussion with us leading that. So if you've had your burning questions, I forgot, Jonathan, what's a Sadducee? Please feel free to ask that. Anything, Aaron?
Okay, we'll begin with a blessing over study and of our gathering together. In Hebrew tradition, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu v'tzav v'tivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah, source of life and inspiration, all knowledge and experience. You have enjoined us to engage with texts of meaning that we might reflect on our lives and their purpose therein. Amen. So I want to give a bit of a recap. The course was inspired by a book called Short Stories by Jesus by Amy Jill Levine, who is perhaps the foremost Jewish scholar about New Testament studies. And I want to just give you a couple quick passages to put this in some context, to tie this back to where we began last fall. This was an inspiration for me. One need not have to believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior in order to realize that he had some extraordinary things to say. There is genius in the parables. She goes on. Jesus told parables because they serve as keys that can unlock the mysteries we face by helping us ask the right questions. How to live in community. How to determine what ultimately matters. How to live the life that God wants us to live. They are Jesus' ways of teaching, and they are remembered to this day, not simply because they are in the Christian canon, but because they continue to provoke, challenge, and inspire. Jesus knew that the best teaching concerning how to live comes from narratives that remind us of what we already know, but are resistant to recall. It comes from stories that prompt us to draw our own conclusions and at the same time force us to realize that our answers may well be contingent, or leaps of faith, or traps. It comes from stories that community members can share with each other, with each of us assessing the conclusions others draw, and so reassessing our own. The parables, if we take them seriously, not as answers, but as invitations, can continue to inform our lives, even as our lives continue to open up the parables to new readings. Jesus knew that the best teaching comes from stories with memorable characters who are both familiar and strange, who play upon our stereotypes, even as they confront our stereotypes. The parables, if we take them seriously, not as historical portraits of real people, but as challenges to our stereotypes, help us to locate both our eccentric traits and our excellent talents. They can inspire and humble, challenge, and comfort. Jesus knew that the best teachings come from stories that make us laugh, even as they make us uncomfortable. The rabbi from Nazareth offers us images of a conniving young man amid the pigs, salivating over the bread enough to spare available at his father's table. Tenacious widows threatening judges with physical harm. A rich man unable to realize that death has changed his position of privilege. A baker surreptitiously hiding yeast in dough that will produce more bread that can possibly feed a single family. A mustard seed that can provide shelter. A lucky fellow who finds treasure in a field. We smile, and at the same time we wonder, are we to be sympathetic to the young man or not? Do we want the widow to achieve her goal? Should the rich man suffer even more until he learns his place? What would we do with all that bread? Do seeds really have such potential? And if seeds, why not you and me? The parables, if we take them seriously, not as meaning, but as soliciting our meaning making, and if we allow ourselves to be open to various interpretations, become not tools for shaming or inculcating guilt, but for good, hard lessons, learned with a sense of playfulness. And at that idea about playfulness, I was reminded of an essay by Reinhold Niebuhr who talks about the connection between humor and faith, and he says this: humor is a prelude to faith, and laughter is the beginning of prayer, for both are expressions of the freedom of the human spirit. So I want us to just remember that as we approach these parables, we do it not so that you'll learn the answer that you missed on the day you were absent in Sunday school, or when your thoughts drifted while the rector was giving the sermon, and this is going to give it to you. I'm projecting. Oh, it's all a projection. It's not so that you should have the answer, the tumblers fall into place, the lock springs open, but rather they're an invitation that's intended to discomfort and reflect to ourselves the way in which we ourselves are incongruous or inconsistent, and the opportunities we have to better understand our lives and the ideals that are being placed before us. So that's the introduction, the recap of what we're doing as we approach this. You don't need to be a believer to appreciate the genius in the parables. You just need to be open enough to appreciate that the parables have something to offer by way of evoking or provoking a reaction from you. And if the reaction is the same reaction you had the last time you read the parable, then it may be worth rereading again or reflecting on how you are not the same as you were the last time you were introduced to the parable. So with that, just as a pretext, are there any thoughts or questions that you bring from the last time, or that you've thought since then, or that you bring with you into the classroom this morning that you want to make sure we get to with regard to parables before we approach the one that we're going to deal with today? Please. Yes? Yes.
I have a question about that, something I've thought about off and on, and this would be really a whole class or 10. So for the mostly Christians in here today, for the Christians, if you had to just do a comparison, would you say the average, this is a total stereotype, so that's what it is, within Judaism, is humor more important, or is it more important humor within Christianity? How many comedians in America are Jewish? A lot, I think. Christianity, particularly, I would say Protestant Christianity, tends to be very serious compared to Judaism. And that's all up and down, left and right, from every facet of that. Something to keep in mind, and this is what Aaron and I are poking at today in an indirect way, is Jesus is rooted within his first century, what we now call modern day Israel context. So he comes from a place, and that's the knowledge base, the ethos in which he lives. And was humor used by the rabbis then and today as a teaching tool?
I think so. I think the reversals and the threads that run through the parables that distinguish them from other biblical material, where there are unexpected reversals or incongruities or upset expectations, is part and parcel of where humor exists. Humor exists between the expectation you have and the reality you experience, or the incongruities between expectations and what you're actually served up. That's how a punchline works. Go ahead.
Here's a story. My mother-in-law will kill me, I'll just preface it with that. This happened a couple days ago about humor is that where expectations don't match up. It's cold, I've been walking everywhere, no car. So I walked in a couple days ago, it's frigid outside, and Natalie's mom, Nellie, was all bundled up, ready to go for a walk on her own. She says, "Oh, Johnny, are you hungry? Would you like something to eat?" I said, "No, I'm fine." And she says, "Oh, I can," she's wearing all winter clothes, "I can take off my clothes and feed you something." And I looked at her and said, "What?" "I can take off my," and she repeated it, and I said, "Did you mean coat?" "Oh, sorry. Yeah, but there's that little twist, and I guarantee you will remember that story more than a whole bunch of other things why do we remember stories that way? Particularly if there's a twist, unexpected point to it. That's how parables function. Sometimes they're funny, but remember, they're not a simple analogy. They're not a simple allegory or example. Look at this nice person, you should be like that. They're fictitious, made up, fictitious stories from everyday life. They almost always have that twist. The twist can be humor. The twist can be, I didn't expect that at all. That's how they function. Partly to make them memorable, partly for you to not understand the clear, this is the point I'm making, but for you to draw meaning out of that yourself. That is the extra level of meaning that a parable provides that other things can't. You've got to draw your own meaning, and the twist, sometimes humor, helps you to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say that, my sister and I, when we were little, someone would say something is funny, and you go, "You mean ha-ha funny or just unusual?" Right? So we tend to think of humor needing the laugh track or needing the other, but when something is just incongruous and unexpected, it falls in that category of what's humorous, or trying to square the circle. Whether Protestant Christianity or Judaism is more humorful or mirthful, I had a professor who suggested once that where Christianity is comfortable with paradox, Judaism is comfortable with ambiguity. Is that interesting? And ambiguity is the space in which humor or puns and double entendre exist, right? Such as, "I'll take off my clothes and help you," that kind of thing. Appreciate that it's a synonym, and if you miss the idiom, then it's funny. And if you don't miss the idiom, if you don't understand that, then it's not funny, right? The idea, the quote I gave from Niebuhr before, and from an essay on, where did I put it? Oh, it's right here. Humor and Faith. "Humor is a prelude to faith. Laughter is the beginning of prayer. Both are expressions of the freedom of the human spirit." Right? He goes on to say that sometimes humor is laughter is the only appropriate response to incongruity, but if it has the final word, in this essay it goes on, so in the face of great evil, or in the face of death, to only laugh at it makes it all meaningless. And so we're sort of playing in this space of belief, of faith and humor and the rest. So we approach these parables with an expectation that a biblical text or an authoritative text is going to spell out what's expected of us, right? That's the definition of a text that we can rely upon, is one that we can turn to and we all understand what it means at face value. But a parable doesn't give up its meaning so quickly or so easily. So we're going to look at this. The other thing I wanted to suggest to you is that the milieu or the context to which Jonathan was referring, out of which Jesus comes, we don't know exactly what rabbinic training included such that one was recognized as a rabbi. To this day, rabbinic ordination, other than at accredited seminaries where they have the accreditation from the state in which they're located and are recognized among universities and graduate programs such that they can award degrees based on the Board of Regents of different states and the rest. The idea of rabbinic ordination is something that's passed from one rabbi to the next at a certain point when it's believed that that student has merited or has earned or learned that which needs to be acquired. And so rather than it being an academic degree, such as a master's degree or a doctorate degree, it's a communal certification or recognition that one rabbi grants to another. So somewhere along the line, as Jesus was maturing, he came to be recognized as a teacher among his peers, or had learned well what was going on. But what's the context? I want to suggest to you that, if you will, the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible with which Jesus would have been most familiar, because that was the body of literature that made up the Jewish canon, essentially, certainly the lectionary of what was being read on a weekly basis, so that in a year we read through the entire cycle. We might think of the entire Torah as an allegory or as a parable of sorts. And the story of the Garden of Eden might readily lend itself to that. You say, well, I can suspend disbelief about a talking snake, or about there being one tree in a garden and one couple who populated the entire world. And I can even make that allowance perhaps for Noah and the ark, and maybe for the Tower of Babel, and a few of these other kinds of stories that seem clearly to be allegorical, or clearly to not be historically based. We get a little bit more complicated perhaps. We speak of pharaonic Egypt and Moses and the slaves. We get a bit of economic history. But if we understand the sweep of the Bible, at least the Torah, first 5 books, being essentially a parable, that is to say, not an historical record, but rather a means of describing the human experience, or a particular case within the human experience, so that we can draw meaning from it beyond simply knowing what our great-great-grandfather did for a living, then Jesus is very comfortable playing with these ideas, or positing situations. There's a garden, there's a vineyard, there's a this person, there's a that person, who, if my study's gone correctly, only Lazarus and Father Abraham get named in these parables. Otherwise, they're just individuals who show up with certain jobs or relationships and occupations. So I wanted to suggest that as where parables originate. And then, of course, there's in Genesis a number of stories where dreams become important parts. And so Jacob has dreams about his brothers bowing down to him, or Joseph interprets dreams when he's in the Egyptian prison, about the cupbearer and the sick calves and the fat calves, and particularly a famine and the rest. And those also are rather, I don't know if the adjective, I said this before, is parabolic. But they draw from, I think that has to do with geometry, but they draw from the parable tradition, or the parable tradition, perhaps more accurately, comes out of that narrative also. Right?
Why do they do that? Why do they write that way? It's much easier to remember. Also, just for us to consider, the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and a lot of other stories for that matter, were not written down or printed and published. There was an oral tradition for a long time. And if you don't believe me, go home. Is it easier to memorize a story with certain repetitive points, or is it easier to memorize a big list of stuff that happened? So part of it is to be able to remember to pass it on so the story stays intact rather than gets diluted over time. Think about, too, with Jesus from that ethos of telling these stories. He's taking all his tradition and he's trying to, what are all the parables about in one way or the other? The kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. From the Jewish perspective, you'd more say the Messianic age. What the world looks like when God's dream, vision for the world comes to fruition. And so these are all different ways of coming at it. Filtered, the kingdom of God filtered through stories of everyday life. A great point. That's what Jesus is doing. So from his own heritage of all these stories Aaron mentioned, the flood and Noah, and then history, what is it, and how is it is a better way to say it, how is it that I want to convey what my gift to the world is, sharing here with the kingdom? And so Jesus chose these stories. There are a lot of things I wish that we knew. His dad, earthly father Joseph, was probably a carpenter or stonemason. How in the world did he get to learn all this stuff? We don't know. How old was Jesus? Do we know his whole life story, or it's just bits and pieces? He's a little baby till about how old? Kind of. We know for a couple weeks. And then it skips to, he was 12 years old and taught in the temple. And then it's silent until he's about 30. So we know virtually nothing about his formation, where he comes from, other than, well, he was born here and here's where his parents, because that's making particular points about his lineage. But the rest of why he thinks what he does, his own kind of a spiritual autobiography, we might talk about that in Education for Ministry, or everybody in the ordination process has to write a spiritual autobiography. I would highly commend that to you, and that is, how has all the major points in my life in which God has been active. So if you, for myself, I grew up moving lots of places. It was a 1 year here, 1 year there, up until I was like 14 or 15. Then I was a few years one place. And so that sense of dislocation was present. And then in college, I started doing this, and this, and found churches. But part of my story is meeting God in these various ways, and not really until college when I found the Episcopal Church, or it found me. And then from there, you can talk about all the ways God was active. We can't do that, unfortunately, with Jesus. We just know bits and pieces, but we can make educated guesses from that, from his stories. Aaron, what else do you want to say before I jump into the parable itself?
The only thing I was going to say about before we jump into the parable is to caution, again, a quote from Amy Jill Levine, about the way titles of parables, and perhaps even of characters, and if you will, just the translations that come to us. Jonathan's very good about identifying that this word is from here, but it shows up here, it's the same word, right? That suggests a connection thereby. But the translations we're reading are themselves subjective corruptions of an original text.
Everybody's biased or prejudiced to a certain way or another.
So I just want to point out that when we speak of the dishonest judge or the dishonest manager, or right, we label the prodigal son, it's shaping our understanding of it. So I just want you to hold that lightly as we make those references, or be willing to play with some synonyms of translations, appreciating that gives us a little bit more room to maneuver. And not be hemmed in I just wanted to hold these texts a little bit more lightly so that we don't squeeze the life out of them.
Remind us, it's not, the story we're talking about is the unjust judge, which we'll read in a moment. The line right after this reminds us it's also talking about the Pharisees. Aaron, who are the Pharisees?
The Pharisees are understood as the rabbis of the time. They were the rabbis. They were the Jewish elite scholars.
Jewish elite scholars. So Jesus is not a Pharisee, but he is a teacher, a rabbi. And when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, it was the rabbi, and you couldn't do temple worship with priests that they had known that sustained the culture. It became rabbis, Aaron and people like him, who helped make the faith transportable and transmutable over time. So that they're not, whenever we talk about the Pharisees, they're not all bad. Some of them are lovers of money. Think of a better equivalent than talking about the rabbis, all the Congress people serving today in the United States. Do some of them have deals with BlackRock and Raytheon? Not being political, but maybe. Do some of them have the best interest of the working man and woman in mind? Maybe a few. Are they all bad people? No. Maybe. Thank you, Tom. Good one. But think of them in that, and again, hold it lightly so you don't squeeze the life out of it. Are they all bad? No. Are they all good? No. But they're the bad guy, often in the context of the story. They're serving a particular role within that. This is Luke.
I'm just thinking of the song about, Pete Seeger has a song about what'd you learn in school today, what'd you learn in school, right? And it's that one of the verses that all of our elected officials, we deserve our elected officials, we elected them one by one. That's sort of the line, right? So sure, they're all bad, but we only have ourselves to blame.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Luke, Gospel Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. This is often called the parable of the unjust steward. Think of what you would call it. Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned the manager and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give me an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as a manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, and how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and make it 80. His master commended the dishonest manager because he has acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. How about that one? What's that?
The very beginning of this starts out with accusations against the manager for squandering his master's money.
Yes.
He turns around and summons everybody and starts reducing their debt, which in a sense is squandering his master's money again, yet he's commended for acting shrewdly by his master. Help.
Well, yeah, that's the point of the class, for us to discuss this.
There's much more after that, but just up to that point.
It is. There's a lot going on in this one. What would you call this parable? Difficult. This, by the way, why I saved it, we were going to do this on November 20th, and we couldn't do that class. We needed to be together for a while before we looked at this one. This is often judged to be the most difficult, the most challenging of all of Jesus' parables. This is a good example of remembering not to just make a parable, a fictitious tale drawn from everyday life that has a twist to it so you can derive your own meaning from it. Not to just make this into a simple allegory. Oh, this is God. This means that. It's not a perfect example story. Oh, look, this is how you should go behave too. But it's a parable that has that twist to it. The twist is, what the heck, Jesus? This is a terrible story. Of all the things you could have told, why did you have this one? And why is this in the book of Luke? And who's the good guy? Who the good woman, the good person in this story? Really? Is the manager good? How did the manager get this, quote, dishonest wealth? But by the way, in the King James Version, everywhere it says wealth or dishonest wealth, the translation was mammon. So we have that word. Mammon is not exactly, but how we talk in popular culture, movies, books, about dirty money. It suggests that. In this, from the very beginning, there's not even mentioned, but there's an accusation made. I have a personal experience with crazy accusations made in secret that have no basis in truth. There's no evidence. You just say stuff. So there's a character in the story that's the accuser that's not named. In many cultures, maybe this person is a whistleblower or a rat. Those are the two words that come to mind. And outed him and makes an accusation. And so the landowner, and by the way, how does the landowner, it's not obvious to us in this English translation. What's it say, 100 jugs of oil? We're talking about mass-scale farming here, agriculture. And so when it's 100 jugs, this is not 100 bottles of wine. We're talking about, a year's worth of money here. And so he's cutting that in half. The wheat, same thing. It's a year's worth of wheat that, several families would produce. So this is not a little bit of money we're talking about. It's a whole lot of money. And how did that landowner get all that? We don't know. Is the landowner renting, tenant farming his land, where they pay a certain fee every year and then they get to farm? Are they sharecropping on his land? Do they own it and they, the farmers take a part of what they make and keep it and take the rest of it and give it? We don't exactly know, but it doesn't seem all on the up and up just to begin with there. It's a little iffy. So we got a guy making an accusation. Notice how it starts. There was a rich man. Does that sound vaguely familiar in any of the other parables we studied? Or there was a certain rich man? Who does it remind you of? The rich man and Lazarus. So here's help was Tom's very simple. By the way, that's one of the best prayers you can ever offer. Help, thank you. Just total, there you go, extra. The chapter before this, Jesus told a few parables in a row. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and one goes missing, doesn't go out and find it, do everything you can, and then rejoice? So the parable of the lost sheep, immediately followed by another parable about the kingdom. A woman who had 10 silver coins lost one, and she looked high and low and found it, and then had a party. So parable 1, lost sheep, lost coin. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and one of them asked for his father's inheritance. The younger one, Dad, I don't care if you're dead or alive, give me my money. And then when he went off, what did the young man do with that money? Squandered. It's the same verb in Greek in both stories, by the way, squandered, which we don't, how often do you say squander? Use squander this week in a sentence. See if you can do that. So those 3 stories, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, immediately to this story. So they fit in a row in context. And what follows immediately after this is the rich man and Lazarus. So they're all, one way or the other, particularly the big ones, about money. It's not money as the point, but money is like context, subtext that's happening all throughout here. And they're using similar language and similar stories, and there's some parables. There was a rich man, is how Lazarus and the rich man start, and how this one starts too. There was a rich man who had a manager, and so on. So these are all connected and help interpret one another, if that makes sense. What did the prodigal son used his money foolishly, and this dishonest manager, unjust steward, used the money foolishly. This commentator notes the prodigal son gets into trouble after spending money foolishly. And what did the elder brother in that prodigal son story complain about? I've always been good. You never gave me a goat. You never threw me a party, Dad. Why don't you love me? I'm right here. There's all that going on. And this other one squandered it. And the manager got into trouble for squandering the rich man's property. So Luke, the writer, is connecting those 2 stories by their closeness within the text, but also using the same word. The rich man will suffer, and the Lazarus, eternal torment because he enjoyed riches selfishly while not helping Lazarus, who was on his doorstep.
I jump in?
Yeah.
Yep. So as I'm reading this, I wonder if the references and all the various synonyms that are provided here to money, whether it's, what are the words, dishonest wealth, squandering your property, but all these various synonyms or euphemisms for what we're describing as money, isn't itself sort of a stumbling block? What if I were to press you and ask you what your most precious possession is, or the greatest gift you have from God, or that which at the end of the day you tell someone, well, at least you have your health, or at least you're alive? What if we understood that which God gives in this parable under the management of this manager, or gives to everyone, that your property or your most precious possession or your mammon or your wealth is your time, is your life? It seems to me that if we were to describe what we squander and we were honest, we probably would need to concede that we squander our time more than we do other things. At least we wouldn't use the word squander with our money. We tend to think of ourselves as rather deliberate. We may have made a bad investment, or we may have overpaid for this, or we didn't really need to do that, but we enjoyed it. But we don't think of it as squandering, we justify it. But time, we appreciate only too late, has slipped through our fingers, or we didn't make the best use of it. What if we thought of what the manager, which is, I'm going to invite us to imagine, just for this sake, is each one of us has a possession we're entrusted to manage well, our lives, and then we are called to give an account of it. And if someone then said to our boss that this one over here is squandering the gift he's been given, you've given him, you have an inexhaustible supply, God, of time or of life, right? What have you. And you can apportion it out to as many as you wish. But each one of us only has a finite amount. And that if we squander it, or if we don't use it well, because of any number of things, I'll suggest as we drop down the parable, I haven't thought this through completely, so I'm just sort of proffering it. And we now go to the other debtors. If it's a manager of a rich man's property and the debtors, well, then we know how the triangle works. But if the debtors are no different than the manager, insofar as they too have been given a portion, a certain amount of time, the word talent, which we understood last semester, was both a weight, right, or possessions, but also gave rise to the notion that you have certain talents that you're expected to do something meaningful with. If the manager, in calling together the other debtors, which is to say the other human beings who have also been given a gift of time or of life, but with an expectation that they owe 100 jars of oil, or that they owe this much of wheat, and perhaps the manager is saying, don't overwhelm yourself with what you imagine you owe, but rather do the best that you can. We're going to take out the words dishonest, and we're going to take out the word shrewdly because they color it in an ugly way. We're just going to talk about the ways in which each of us reflects upon what's expected of us, or what we owe back to the rich man, to the Creator, to God. For me, it elides the idea that we're focused too much on the amount of dollars that we have, or that we're measuring ourselves against who's in debt and who's responsible for forgiving debts or what have you. But if we said that every human being in the story is equal because we each have been given these talents, this time, whatever it is, the possibilities, the potential, the capabilities that we have, and we're only expected to live up to our own, what then changes about the story? What then does it mean? And if you believe your time is your own, or if you believe that you've somehow earned this because I worked hard and now I can retire and my time is my own, then you misunderstand. Yes?
There's no reference in the story at all of the rich man saying, how do you know this?
Right.
Prove it before we go and talk to these people.
There's no, of the rich man saying, there is a question, is there not, right early, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting? Is that?
We could say it's probably the rich man thinks the manager is simply incompetent. He's mismanaged the funds. It's not fraud, because if it were fraud, the guy would be out immediately. He's just an idiot. He's made some mistakes. He's not trying to steal from me. So that's probably the case from the story. From there...
A few questions.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
What is meant by the context of so that people may welcome me into their home? And he seems
so that people may welcome me into their home.
So my interpretation, playing this out, and they say their eternal home, right? I thought that was memory. What if it's memory? That's how we keep people in our eternal home. The ways in which those persons, this is sort of a Jewish idea about what time immemorial is, or the way we earn everlasting life is the way in which we're remembered. And if you're remembered for blessing, well, that's a wonderful place to live, not the rest of your life, but to live on beyond yourself, right? This mortal coil. And if you behave in such a way that you're remembered for ill repute, or you're remembered, right? People don't blot out your name. That's a very different idea. So I'm just playing with the idea that if it's too tangible, we're talking about this amount of debt, and the ledger is going to be reduced by this amount, so that I'll then have access to your spare bedroom when I'm out of work. Okay, maybe so. Maybe so.
So in this, to get to the question there, the manager realizes he's caught. Oh my God, what am I going to do? So he starts reducing the debts of the various people. Some commentators have suggested, he's reducing his commission. Probably not. But what is functioning with that society is effectively very much what happens now. If I do you a favor and you a favor, when you really need it, I expect you to do, and you would expect to do something back to me. So while I've still got the power, I can do these things, and it's not technically, I'm not stealing the money because I do have the authority, but I can write these things off, and then when I'm too weak to dig or too proud to beg, isn't that a 60s song? From there, I will expect you to, look after me for at least a while, give me a good job reference, find me something, not necessarily pay for everything forever, but there's that sense of reciprocity that is happening, so that they may take me into their home. That's really historically what that has meant. So he writes off the debts, and then the story goes, and then his master commended this dishonest manager because he has acted shrewdly. Another way, wisely, with prudence. Those are different ways of saying that. Allison? Right. This is a typical story that argues from lesser to greater. If you're responsible for a little bit, then maybe you can be responsible for more. But if you can't be responsible, be a good steward of a little bit, how in the world could we ever expect you to be a good steward, caretaker of more? What are the real riches in the Gospel of Luke? Faith. The kingdom is the paramount one there. That's the most important thing. And so you could say the parable ends there, and then it's a commentary in the story by Jesus on the parable. And that is beginning to interpret it, again, within the context of what comes before and what comes immediately afterward. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is also honest in much. If you guys, I don't know how many priests can't add, but most of them. So I've learned that I think Russ was impressed because I understood what that's supposed to do, keep the water out, and how you pay for things, and how to, again, count and all that. Not many priests can do that. Jesus is making a point here that if you Christians, disciples specifically, can't understand the very basics of the kingdom that I've been talking about over and over and over, how do I expect you to know anything at all? And look at these, the two phrases, children of light, children of darkness. Children of light are the good guys, the white hats, that's the disciples. And the children of darkness, everybody, the world, everybody else, If they can understand basic things about how society works and how reciprocity works and how I scratch my back, you scratch mine work, why can't you get that and apply that to the life of faith? If you're not even good with that stuff, how are you ever going to be good with something that really matters, from lesser to greater? So try not to get caught up in the, what is this example, as Jesus is pushing them. And remember the twist. Why is not everybody, there's not clear good guys and bad guys in this. You need to learn to use what you've got for good and be trustworthy with that, and then you can be entrusted with more of something that really matters. Another example, any of you, one person here doesn't drive yet, I'm guessing. But do you remember driving? Did you get to drive the Mercedes or the Lexus your first go? Oh, Lord, I hope not. You got the old beat-up junker car where the transmission was shot, or if you bumped in the wall, it didn't matter. You learn on that. And then if you're trustworthy and you bring it home one time and you don't wreck it, then you get the, this car and then maybe the really nice one for prom or something. That is a very similar logical progression that Jesus is making in this story here. Either, and if you've not been faithful with what belongs to another, a key point in the Gospel of Luke, and Aaron suggested that, in the economy of God, not just money, but the whole realm of it, everything belongs to whom? God is the short answer. So these things that you think you own, you're steward of, you're really just taking care of someone else's stuff, God's stuff. And so if you can't handle God's stuff in your own personal life, how can you expect to go to this level and this level? So be prudent, be wise, handle that with care, even in the smallest things, and then you'll get to graduate. And the key, the last line is the real twister there. You can't serve God and wealth. You can't serve God and mammon. Switch mammon or wealth to time or anything else other than God, and it still works. So is that your highest priority? The kingdom, the relationship with God, and everything else falls into place? Or do I think I'm the master of my own castle and destiny, and that I am the one who makes all the decisions? All those other weak people, they got lucky, it fell into the lap. I earned what I got. That's a typical American thinking of stuff. I've earned it, everybody else is lazy, or they just inherited or something. And so there's some of the same things going on here. None of this belongs to you. And so Jesus is poking and twisting and turning to get all of us to understand that. So is there a good guy in this story? There are regular people in this story. That's part of the beauty of it. Are there any good guys, good girls in this room? You're all special and clever and handsome, yes. But you're all, in the historic, we'd say all sinners, all fallen short of the glory of God. And Aaron and I are in that category. That's part of the point that Jesus is making. So if you look at it from the context of prodigal son, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and then right afterwards the rich man and Lazarus, it does start to make a little bit more sense. But out of context, this is like preaching on this is beyond impossible. It takes 45 minutes to do. That's why when you, hey Aaron, guess who's preaching this week? What else do you want to add?
I have a thought, but I'll share. Go ahead.
Who are the children we're saying, and this master commanded them, this on what he said, for the children of this age are more shrewd. What's he talking about?
Children of this age is
Are we children of this age or children of light?
You could say, so the question is, are we children of this age, children of darkness in some translations? Children of light is kind of the opposite. Children of light is a term that Jesus is making for the disciples and those trying to live by faith. It's not necessarily, the world is not equally divided between good and bad, rich and poor, and so on and so forth. But try to be like those other people who already understand the basic things of life. That would be the children of this age. They understand how things work, what's what. They have street sense.
To be a child of light is to be aspirational. Question
Yeah,
mark?
that's a good way to put it.
So who was he preaching this to? Who's he telling this to?
Great question, who heard this story? Other than we did today, we little band of sinners heard the story. It says at the beginning, this was told to the disciples, but don't ever mistake Jesus with being wise and kind for also being nice all the time. Jesus is not nice, as in milquetoast. The very next line, so 13 it ends, you cannot serve God and wealth. Then it says, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard this, and they ridiculed him. So this is like telling a story about some jerk Cleveland guy, while you're at the game, the Steelers against the Browns, saying it as loudly as possible so all those other people hear it too. That's part of what's going on. So it's a criticism of the Pharisees, who again are not all bad, but some of those who were lovers of money, focusing on the wrong non-kingdom things. So it was disciples, all the people, and then the Pharisees heard it too.
Please.
Yeah, a pragmatic question. Where can one find the list of texts that we'll discuss beginning next week and in the future?
Pragmatic, where can one find the list of texts that we will discuss now and in the future? That would be when I email it out and put it online.
Will it come out this week?
Most likely, yes. The Advent and Christmas, and then I've been looking for a car for 3 weeks, and then Neil's been gone for a month. Those things all made me not do that. So soon. What other questions you have? I'm being told it's time. Thank you very much.